Good morning and welcome back to Cluster 2 Info Day. After a short break, we are going to continue with some issues which are particularly important for this cluster of cross-cutting nature. I hope that you've already seen the webinar on the gender equality provisions, which is out on the web page, and posted your questions in Slido. And I can see that some of the questions have already started coming in, so that's good. I would now like to present my colleagues, which will be in this session. First of all, I have Ulrich Genschel sitting here next to me in the studio, and he is from RTDH3, and he will be responsible for the lump sum funding, amongst other things that he is also doing. Then remotely, I have Anne Pepin from RTD D4, who is responsible for the gender equality provisions, and that's her here. And then finally, I have Nicole Scotti from RTD F1, who will be responsible for the international collaboration. We will now continue with a recorded presentation on international collaboration, which is a common issue in our program. We've had it for many years, but I think that it's never been more important than right now. We have a lot of high-level problems in the world that needs technological solutions on a global scale. So please don't forget to in Slido while we see the presentations. Please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Nicole Scotti, and I'm a policy officer in the European Commission's Directorate General for Research and Innovation, and more specifically, Directorate F, which is responsible for the global approach and international cooperation. I'm going to start by telling you a bit about the global approach to research and innovation, which is a strategy that underpins international cooperation in research. The Commission adopted its communication on the global approach to research and innovation, Europe's strategy for international cooperation in a changing world, on the 18th of May 2021. The global approach contributes to the EU priority of a stronger Europe in the world and to President von der Leyen's objective to lead a geopolitical commission committed to sustainable policies. As you can see on the slide, the aim of the global approach is twofold: to preserve openness while promoting a level playing field and reciprocity underpinned by fundamental values, and to strengthen multilateral partnerships in order to deliver new solutions to global challenges. There are three main ways in which this will be achieved, and that's through bilateral cooperation, the acceleration of sustainable and inclusive development, and using a so-called Team Europe approach. Now, all this is underpinned by guiding principles. First of all, openness is crucial to accelerate scientific progress, pool resources, and nurture vibrant innovation ecosystems. Under values and principles, well, researchers and innovators should be free to operate within a supportive environment based on values and principles such as academic freedom, research ethics, and the respect for human rights. Science diplomacy can also be an instrument of soft power. As far as the pursuit of a level playing field and reciprocity are concerned, there is a need for a balanced approach to better safeguard the EU's interests and values and boost resilience while maintaining wide openness to cooperation. There's also a need for an assertive promotion of fair innovation ecosystems, open standard setting, non-discriminatory state subsidies, and the protection and enforcement of intellectual property rights. Finally, global cooperation is necessary to tackle global challenges, such as, for instance, pandemics, the climate crisis, and the biodiversity crisis. The EU really wants to bring countries together in multilateral research and innovation partnerships focused on finding solutions to green, digital, health, social, and innovation challenges. Now, the next slides explain some key elements relating to international cooperation in the Horizon Europe work program itself. In line with the global approach, Horizon Europe is as open as possible to the world. But an important distinction needs to be made between access to the program and access to funding, and I will go into that in a little bit. In addition to the default mode of openness, the Commission has also identified some more targeted international cooperation actions where we want to make international cooperation stronger, more explicit, or more forceful, if you like. Of course, while promoting international cooperation in Horizon Europe, we must also be careful that this cooperation doesn't go against the interests of the EU. This is why a number of mechanisms have been put in place to safeguard EU interests. So I'm going to go into a little more detail on each of these four elements. First of all, going back to openness, well, Horizon Europe is the most internationally open research program in the world. Horizon Europe is also a non-discriminatory program whereby researchers and innovators from all nationalities can, in principle, participate. And in case you haven't realized in your work or following these presentations, the EU is extremely proud of Horizon Europe in general, but it's also proud of its openness to the world, which allows the most excellent scientists to collaborate regardless of their origin. Now, there is a rule, an important rule in relation to this. In the case of collaborative projects under Pillar 2, which of course includes Cluster 2, there is a condition that the consortium must include a minimum of 3 participants from different EU member states or associated countries, with at least 1 EU member state. International partners must come in addition to this minimum. However, this really is a minimum. Why? Because consortia usually tend to have many more participants, around 10 or 11 or 12. But it is extremely important that all of you in Europe are aware of the possibilities of international cooperation under Horizon Europe, because this rule does mean that in the end, you are the ones that will be bringing the international partners into the consortia. Now, one of the innovative points of Horizon Europe, as opposed to its predecessor programs, for instance, Horizon 2020, is that Horizon Europe extends its openness to third countries anywhere in the world, as long as they meet a number of criteria, offering them the possibility to become a so-called associated country. And on this slide, you can see the current status in relation to association. Now, moving on to the important issue of funding. As you can see, access to funding is automatic for most low and middle income countries, as well as the associated countries that we just had a look at. Unless, of course, there are limitations or conditions which are laid out in the work program and or the topic texts. But these relate to a very small number of cases, and I will go through those in a minute. Now, other non-associated, mostly high-income countries do not have automatic access to EU funding and need to bear their own costs for participation. However, there are exceptions. These are decided on a case-by-case basis. For example, if the participation is crucial for the project or when it's specifically mentioned in the topic call. I have to admit, this is not overly common, but it definitely does exist. Next, some countries have in place co-funding mechanisms by a national funding body in order to provide financial support to their entities that participate or wish to participate in Horizon Europe projects. Each country is free to decide on the budget, the modalities, and the conditions of such a co-funding mechanism. And on the Funding and Tenders portal, you can find a guide with a section for each country that has such a mechanism. If if we look at this slide, it's fairly self-explanatory. There is flagging of core topics specifically relevant for international cooperation. And I encourage those of you interested to go to the Funding Intendants portal and filter for international cooperation. You can also filter for Africa or for the Mediterranean, because as you can see in the next slide, there is targeted cooperation with Africa under the Horizon Europe Africa initiative and with the Mediterranean under the Mediterranean initiative. Cooperation with China is currently in line with the ongoing discussions on the joint roadmap, with the aim of taking a more nuanced and transactional approach. Now, the openness of the work programme to international cooperation is balanced with the need to safeguard EU interests in strategic areas, and in particular to promote the EU's strategic autonomy, its technological leadership, and competitiveness. In a very limited number of cases, and I have to stress that the cases are very limited, for actions related to Union strategic assets, interests, autonomy, or security, actions can be limited to cooperation between legal entities in member states only, in member states and certain associated countries, and or certain third countries, the so-called eligible countries. These actions are based on Article 22.5 of the Horizon Europe regulation, and you can also see on the slide the rather technical second part of Article 22.5, but I'm not going to go into further detail in this because there are no topics in Cluster 2 that make use of Article 22.5. 31 topics use Article 22.5 in the entire work programme of 2023-24. That's a reduction from the 49 topics, that are used in work programme 21-22. These 31 topics represent a budget of 475.5 million. That's only 3.5% of the overall budget of the work programme. And of these 31 topics, 2 are in Cluster 3, and the rest, 29 in fact, are in Cluster 4. And fall in key technological areas, and more specifically raw materials, quantum, and space topics. As I said, there are no topics using Article 22.5 in Cluster 2. Now, there are additional articles which are used to safeguard EU interests, as you can see on this slide. And Article 22.6 is currently applied to limit Chinese participation in innovation actions due to the lack of progress with the roadmap's framework conditions linked to innovation. To the next slide. Now, there are sanctions against Russia and Belarus, also in the field of research and innovation. There is a general prohibition provision in the general annexes to the 23-24 work programme, as you can see, with exceptions on a case-by-case basis, and also an exemption for individual fellowships under the Marie Skłodowska-Curie Action Programme. But all these cases of restrictions that I've described in the last few slides, they're quite limited overall. So I wanted to end on a note of openness. To remind you, first of all, that the vast majority of the topics in the 23-24 work programme are open to the world, and to show you some figures on the topics where international cooperation is encouraged. So you will see that in Cluster 2, 15 of the 66 topics, so specifically 27%, encourage international cooperation, notably in destination democracy. And overall, out of the 730 topics in total in the work programme, 141, so 22%, encourage international cooperation. Now, I do encourage all of you, those of you who are interested, to go ahead and to look at these links. I understand you will have access to these slides and to these links. I hope that you found this presentation useful. And all that remains is for me to thank you for your interest in international cooperation and to wish you much success in your research or in your related work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nicole. And we will now continue with a live presentation here in the studio about lump sum funding, which is being used in Cluster 2 for the very first time. It's a different process to assemble a proposal like this, and therefore it's really important to get it right. And with this, I would like to pass the floor to Ulrich Genschel, who is sitting here next to me.
Thank you very much, Sören. Thank you for the opportunity to present and explain lump sum funding, which indeed is now in 23-24 used for the first time in a really significant way in the framework program. Next slide, please. I'd like to start by explaining why we have been testing this in Horizon 2020 and now rolling it out more widely. There are really three main reasons, in no particular order presented here. It's the financial error rate that has been at around 4% or above in the framework program, and there's very wide agreement that this has to come down. We see lump sum funding as a main mechanism to achieve that. Then, of course, there is significant simplification potential because lump sum grants will not need to report actual cost and resources. This is the main source of errors, and of course, it's also a major administrative burden, both actually inside and outside the Commission at the beneficiaries. So skipping this step essentially is a big step to a simpler grant management. And then last but not least, we also want to achieve a better focus on the content by not having any financial management to do anymore. The idea is that the scientific, the technical content of the grant gets more attention on all sides. Next slide, please. And one particularly important simplification aspect is for the very large number of small entities that participate in the program. In this little graph, you see on the left-hand side that more than 20,000 individual beneficiaries, unique participants in Horizon 2020 had exactly just one grant in the 7-year period. If I count all those that had 1 or 2 grants, I come to 3/4 of all unique beneficiaries. And of these small entities, largely, we cannot really expect to have dedicated structures, the necessary experience, the administrative capacity to deal with actual costs, and we already see that these have a much higher error rate. So we need a system that works for those small entities that participate rarely. On the right-hand side of the distribution, you see a relatively small number of big beneficiaries that have more than 100 grants in a framework program, but this is less than 0.5% of our unique beneficiaries. And generally speaking, the error rate associated with those large beneficiaries is much lower. But we need a system that works for everybody participating in the program. And here, lump sum funding is the model that can lead the way. Next slide, please. So I like to go through some very basic principles. I cannot go through all the details of lump sum funding, but you'll see later where additional information is available on the following slides somewhere. The basic principles is that we have designed lump sum funding in a way to keep this approach of the actual cost grants as much as possible. So we introduced the minimum number of changes to make this possible. In other words, we still use the same templates. We follow the same evaluation criteria. You receive your payments at exactly the same point in time, and you also use the same technical reporting template, although with a focus on the work packages that have been completed. The lump sum is shared or is divided in lump sum shares. There's not just one lump sum for the entire grant, but in the grant it will be divided into lump sum shares, 1 share for each work package and beneficiary. That allows in the end for a super simple financial reporting where all you do is you declare which work packages have been completed, and according to the pre-agreed scheme, that you see at the bottom of the slide, that is essentially the financial annex in the grant agreement of a lump sum grant, we will pay the shares of those work packages that have been completed and agreed as completed. Next slide, please. So when it comes to writing lump sum proposal, again, many things or most things work in the very same way as they work in a standard grant. You use the very same application form. You present your objective and methodology in the same way. And of course, you cover your activities in each work package. What's different, and that is really the only difference, is that you have to, in addition, provide a detailed budget table with the cost estimations. And that detailed budget table is the basis for defining, justifying, and agreeing the lump sum. You are entirely free, as in an actual cost grant, to define this budget of the lump sum grant as it is in an actual cost grant, but you have to provide the necessary detail to underpin this request. The budget table is in the form of an Excel file that you get in the submission system. Make sure that you use the file that is available in the submission system, not any other version that might be available from other sources or that you can find also on the Funding and Tenders portal. That's only for information. The version to be used in your application is the one in the submission system. Next slide, please. So a few more details on this detailed budget. It goes without saying that what we have there, because it's upfront, these are cost estimations. So what you have to provide in the end are estimations for each cost category, for each beneficiary, and resolve that for each work package. I stress that what you provide are approximations. By definition, upfront, you can't present costs as accurately as they would be in an as they would be when you claim them ex post in an actual cost grants. So they don't need to be accurate in that sense. They just need to be the best possible estimates that you have at the time of writing your grant. They need to be in line with the eligibility rules. In short, any cost item that would be eligible in a standard grant is also eligible in your lump sum grant. They must be in line with your normal practices, and that's the key point also for our assessment. They must be reasonable and non-excessive. That is what we are going to check afterwards. And of course, they must be in line with your activities and necessary to support them. Then this detailed budget table is going to automatically calculate the lump sum shares per work package and per participant, as we saw in this little graph before. And you can use that to include in the grant agreement. This would then happen during grant preparation. There is sufficient information in this table included to know how to complete it in detail. Next slide, please. There's one other aspect that you should pay attention to when designing your lump sum grant, your lump sum proposal, and that is the number of work packages. There is as we just saw, one basic principle is that you will be reimbursed for your work once work packages have been completed and paid at the end of each reporting period. So the payment scheme is the same as before. You get payments at the end of each reporting period. I stress also, you of course also get a pre-financing payment. So the payments are the same as before. And with the work packages, that define your reimbursement payment at the end of each reporting period, you have the possibility to split them along the reporting periods. The background is, if you have work packages that lead through the entire duration of the grant, you would be able to get reimbursed for those activities only and at the end of the work package, meaning at the end of the grant. For example, if you have a management work package that lasts for the entire duration of the grant, you would be paid at the end of the grant for that management activity. Now, if you would like to be reimbursed as in a standard grant for these activities along the reporting periods, you have the possibility to split that work package into as many work packages as there are reporting periods. In this way, you would of course then be able to get reimbursed for each of these work packages at the end of the reporting period. And this can happen not only for management, dissemination, exploitation, it can also happen for technical work packages. The only condition is that the resulting work packages that you design still make sense as work packages. They still need to be a significant subdivision of the work of the grant. In other words, we would not expect you to have an endlessly high number of work packages. But experts will be briefed that the number of work packages will likely be higher in lump sum grants, so don't hesitate to make use of that mechanism in order to optimize the cash flow in your lump sum grant. Next slide, please. When we evaluate your lump sum proposal, we again follow the same principles as in any other grant. In particular, it's following the very same standard evaluation criteria: excellence, impact, and implementation. And then the additional evaluation is, of course, for the lump sum budget. This will take place under the implementation criterion. And then, as I mentioned before, experts will mainly assess that your cost estimations are reasonable and non-excessive, and whether they will allow you to complete your activities as described in the proposal. Now, it can happen that experts find that some of your costs are overestimated or underestimated or not in line with the activities. And in this case, we ask them to make concrete recommendations to change the budget that you suggested. And you will see enough information in your evaluation summary report to make those changes during grant preparation. Historically, we've had roughly only 10% of the funded grants that needed these changes. In other words, the majority of lump sum budgets went through as proposed. Now, there can also be cases when your lump sum proposal is really flawed and there is really major problems with it, in which case you would not only get recommendations, but you would have a decreased score, which of course would then decrease the likelihood of that proposal to be selected. But again, this is rather an exceptional case. In most cases, if you have recommendations to change the budget, this is really a recommendation that we will take care of during grant preparation. It will not affect the chance of your grant being selected. Next slide, please. I have here an overview of the additional information available. We created a dedicated lump sum page on the Funding and Tenders portal. The link is on the slide. You have all the guidance documents that we assembled in the last 2 years. Also, in response to the feedback that we got after the lump sum pilot, we really massively invested into more guidance and support. And I can mention there's also all the events listed on this page that are available to provide more information. I can mention our next major lump sum webinar on the 9th of February. Please go to this events page and register or find the events page if you're interested. Next slide, please. So that remains here is to mention the next steps. We have a few improvements coming now with the work program 23 is the higher page limit for lump sum proposals, in line with the fact that we have a higher number of work packages on average in lump sum proposals. We also offer a higher page limit. So the page limit goes up roughly by 10%, from 30 pages for coordination support actions to 33, and from 45 pages for innovation actions and research innovation actions to 50 pages. The details you'll also find in the general annexes of the work program. We have just released an improved Excel tool for you to enter your detailed budget estimations to create this lump sum budget that will be available in your topic. And we are working on a collection of best practices which we've gathered from current lump sum beneficiaries to help you with practical aspects beyond the guidance that is already available. And then, generally speaking, we of course continue monitoring all our lump sum grants because it's still a relatively new feature, and we will make adjustments if we see that's necessary. As requested by our stakeholders, we've been phasing in lump sums in a really slow way in Horizon Europe. We've had the test in Horizon 2020. We've had probably less than 5%, way less than 5% lump sum grants in the period 21-22. And now we have the first significant wave in 23, where we probably go up horizon-wide to roughly 10% lump sum budgets. So the first significant wave is starting now. Also with you in Cluster 2. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ulrik, for a very comprehensive overview of the lump sum funding. And I think that we can now use the next 30 minutes for questions and answers as they've been posted in Slido. This is supposed to last until 10:40, and then we will have a short break. So let's go straight to the questions. And I can see that the first question, the most popular question at the moment, is where we can find the PPT presentation for today. And I think that you should be able to find the PowerPoint presentations that covers the topics for today on the website from which you're linking to this session. I've not seen it myself right now, but that should be the case. Then we go to gender equality. Anne, would you mind taking the question? Do I have to say it, or can you see it?
I can say it. Sorry, I was muted.
Okay, then I will say it so that we are sure that everyone is on the same ball. So do affiliated entities and associated partners need to have a gender equality plan as well, or is it only for beneficiaries? Anne, please.
Thank you for the question. So the requirement to have a gender equality plan is for beneficiaries and their affiliated entities. They're in the grant agreement, so both categories need to have a gender equality plan. Associated partners do not. And of course, we're talking here about legal entities that are either beneficiaries or affiliated entities that are research organization, higher education establishment, and any kind of public body from member state and associated countries. International, non-associated third countries are not subject to the eligibility criterion.
Then the next question is also on the gender equality provisions, which is if the gender equality provisions are only for the coordinator or for all partners in the consortium. That's also
it's for all partners. So it's as long as you're one of these three legal entities and you're either a beneficiary or an affiliated entity. So here, I guess the question is more about beneficiaries. Yes, all beneficiaries need to have a gender equality plan.
And when do applicants need to have this gender equality plan ready? Is that at the submission stage, or does it only need to be finished when you do the grant preparation?
Well, there's an effective tolerance, let's say, of this eligibility criterion until the grant agreement preparation stage. So that's really when it's checked by the executive agencies. But it's important that you think about it from the start, from the submission stage, to really not delay the time to grant. And if you don't have it at the grant agreement preparation stage, you will not be allowed to sign the grant agreement. But if you don't have it at submission stage, it will not block you from submitting a proposal in which you are a partner, and it will not affect the evaluation of the proposal.
Okay, thank you very much. And that's very valuable information so that we're not delaying the grant preparation. There is a question about Hungarian universities in Horizon Europe and whether they are all excluded from funding. This is a question that we're not going to answer today. What we're going to do is to ask you to submit this question to the Research Inquiry Service, because at the moment we're working on a common line for doing that. So I would ask you to pose your questions there instead of in Slido. But I appreciate that it's coming up now, because it's a new development that has happened just in the last short period. So I can see that there are some questions on lump sum fundings. Lump sum funding, it states that it's paid on completion of the work package. How does this work for SMEs who require funding to remunerate employees to complete the work package? Ulrich, you have?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think that is not limited to SMEs, but any participant, of course, needs to remunerate their employees to complete the work. You get in a lump sum funding, of course, a pre-financing payment of the very same size as in any grant. So as I try to explain, you will get payments at the same points in time as in a standard grant. The pre-financing typically is rather generous. It can be up to 80% of the total fund in a shorter grant, and typically can be around 50% in longer grants. So this pre-financing is used to get the work started, and then you have the first payments at the end of each reporting period. So that works, in fact, exactly in the same way as in any other grant. So the cash flow in a lump sum grant, I could also say, is the same as in an actual cost grant.
Thank you very much, Ulrich. And are there calls on the cluster 2 that use lump sum funding? Are you aware?
To my knowledge, yes. There is. I don't have a complete overview, but there are two things you can do. I'm sure the colleagues from cluster 2 have a complete overview. There is also on this lump sum page on the participant portal, there's a search function now under opportunities. You can see all lump sum topics that are included in the work program, and you can search for them by keyword. We will improve that search a bit further. You will soon also be able to search by cluster. Not sure if that feature is available already. And of course, let me highlight, if you are interested in a cluster 2 topic, and you find this on the participant portal, the description of that topic will be completely unambiguous of the funding mechanism. It will be very clear if this topic is using actual costs or lump sum funding.
Perhaps I can just add that the largest topic that we have here in Cluster 2, the European Cultural Cloud for Cultural Heritage, is actually using lump sum funding. So at least one of them is using lump sum funding. Then the next one, lump sum, does it mean that the preparation of the proposal will result in much more budget work?
That is indeed a good question. I mean, yes, you need to provide more budget details. In my view, these budget details are necessary in any project. So, for example, you need to know what kind of staff you are going to employ, senior staff, postdocs, PhD students, or any other employees. You need to know this for your budget planning in any grant. The difference in lump sum funding is that you share these details in the lump sum budget table. And well, assuming that you really have these details and you do careful budget planning in any grant, you don't need any additional data. You just need to include them in this budget table. That is indeed an additional step, but we've also had feedback indicating that projects found it very useful to have this table for a detailed overview of their budget.
I think let's just take the next lump sum question as well, because it says, how should the work programs or work packages that span across the whole course of the project, like management, dissemination, communication, be planned in lump sum projects?
So you have two possibilities. You can keep it as you are used to in other grants. In other words, you just keep it as a work package that spans the whole grant. The consequence will be that you will be paid for that activity only at the end of the grant. Now, given that in some grants you have up to 80% pre-financing, this should be not problematic. However, if you consider you really need to be reimbursed for these activities at the end of each reporting period, as is the case in a standard grant, then you have the possibility, it's really an option that you can make use of, to split these work packages into as many reporting periods as they are. In other words, along the borders of the reporting periods. And then there's no need to repeat the content of these work packages 3 times. If you have 3 reporting periods, you can just describe your management activities, for example, for the first reporting period. And then when you have when you replicate that work package for reporting period 2 and 3, you just refer to the first one where the content is the same, because the activities are the same, in the same way as you would have done had you had a work package that lasts the entire duration of the grant. So really, you have both possibilities. It is up to you to decide which one you choose depending on your cash flow needs and the simplicity of your grant application.
And do all beneficiaries have to fill in the timesheets in terms of lump sum funding?
Timesheets, there are no timesheets. I mean, lump sum funding has, there are, I didn't go into these details, but that's sort of one of the big advantages, since you don't have to keep any records in lump sum funding that are related to either costs or resources. So there are no timesheets. There is no invoices. You don't have to have any employee records. All that we are going to check once we have agreed on the lump sum and signed the lump sum grant is that the grant is actually implemented. So if we find that these work packages are completed, the activities are completed, is also an important point to highlight. It's not dependent on you having success in your grant. It's just dependent that you carry out the grant, whether or not objectives are fulfilled and whether your best case scenario comes true. That is not relevant for the payment.
Thank you very much, Ulrich. I think now we go to a different session so that we don't have to charge Ulrich all the time. I think, Nicole, could you answer the next question, which is, can UK entities participate?
Sure. So
it's a very popular question, I would have to say.
Concerning the UK's participation to Work Programme 23-24, the approach applied to Work Programme 21-22 remains in place. So the transitional arrangement and contingency measures will continue to be implemented until further notice. What does this mean in practical terms? Well, this means that entities based in the UK will still be able to apply and be evaluated as beneficiaries in Horizon Europe proposals. On the date of the signature of the grants, the UK will have to be associated to Horizon Europe for the grant agreements to be signed, as prepared. If association is not in place by the time of the grant agreement signature, then UK participants can stay in the consortia, but as so-called associated partners, which means that they do not obtain Horizon Europe funding. And this is provided that minimum requirements of the proposal are still met by the remaining beneficiaries. If the association of the UK is not imminent at the time that the grant agreement signature approaches, the consortia will be informed that they can take action to rearrange the consortia as appropriate. And this will be done a sufficient amount of time in advance before the planned date of the signature of the grant agreement.
Okay, very good. Lucy is asking also on international collaboration. It's great to see the openness of the ERC to international collaboration. And now that, but the work program themes for Cluster 2 seem very Europe focused. Am I wrong?
Well, actually, that's an interesting question because it falls directly into the objectives of my directorate, which is the Directorate on International Cooperation and the Global Approach. Part of our daily work is actually to look at the work program and the different topics, and to work with our colleagues to ensure that where there's scope for international cooperation, this is made very clear. As you saw from my presentation, there is a percentage of topics that actually are flagged for international cooperation, but we do have to remember that Horizon Europe is generally open to international cooperation, whether these are flagged or not, and whether specific countries or regions are mentioned or not. So there is always the scope of international cooperation.
I think when you look at the stats that Nicole presented before, you can also see that Cluster 2 is not so Europe-focused. It is actually quite open to international collaboration. Then there is a question which I am not... okay. If a topic is flagged for international collaboration or cooperation, or Africa chooses a focus, does that not include IC or African countries? I am not sure what that means. Nicole, do you understand the question?
I'm afraid
Perhaps we can get that clarified exactly what is meant here, and then we can revisit it a little bit later. In the meantime, there is a question about whether there is a full list of topics covered by Article 22.5. Nicole, you know?
Yes. There is no full list of topics on Article 22.5 published. However, if you go to the work program and you go to the different topics, you will be able to see a sentence that is phrased something along the lines of, in order to safeguard the Union's strategic assets, interests, autonomy, and security. This is in the eligibility criteria of the specific topic, and this will then go on to say how to state the exact eligibility. So if you go through the topics, you will be able to find the 31 topics that actually use Article 22.5, but I have to remind everyone that 29 of the 31 are actually in cluster, and 2 of them are in cluster 3, so there are no topics using Article 22.5 in cluster 2.
Okay, very good. Then there is a question from Thomas from the Czech Republic. How is a researcher defined? Is there a necessity of a cooperation with the university? And do researchers need to have a university level education? Is any one of you that can answer that question? Or can we try in common, perhaps?
I think that the definition that's used for researchers is the one that comes from the Frascati manual. So that's research and experimental development. So there's a definition about what a researcher covers. So I would refer the person who asked the question to the Frascati manual.
Ulrich?
I agree, and I think this is also linked in the application template. So you should find the necessary information in the application form along the table where you have to list these researchers participating in the proposal.
Okay, thank you very much. Then there is a lump sum question. In lump sum funding, is there a possibility we have an audit of the accounts? Should the leading partner have records of all partners, or make or submit an audit?
You generally have no financial audit in the way that you have financial audits in actual cost grants, because there is really, and that's, I can only emphasize again, the grant agreement that you sign explicitly says that you don't have to keep any financial records for the grant. Now, what theoretically happens, didn't happen so far, is really a very exceptional scenario, but it's not excluded, and that's also covered in the lump sum grant agreement, is that that you could have audits in case of fraud, or in case there's exceptional circumstances or suspicion of fraud, and in that case, again, you would not have to provide financial records for that grant. But since you have usually other record-keeping obligations under national law, for example, or record-keeping obligations in line with the established processes in your organization. So there are some records, not necessarily for the grant, but generally for the works of that organization. In such exceptional circumstances, it's possible that that auditors look at these costs and check if indeed the cost that you claimed or that you proposed in your lump sum grant are reasonable. So that could happen, but that is, well, that's a theoretical possibility, and we already include that in the model grant agreement. But the general line is there is no financial audit in the way that you know financial audits from standard actual cost grants.
Thank you very much, Ulrich. Then we can go to the next one, which is about associated partners, so international collaboration. How do associated partners e.g. from middle-income countries, benefit from the grant? Can they receive funding in the same way as the main beneficiaries? Nicole?
Okay, so associated partners are entities that implement action tasks but without receiving EU funding. They do not become party to the grant agreement. They do not sign the grant agreement, but they implement important parts of the action and are thus often involved actively in the consortium. Therefore, the grant agreement mentions them and defines their role and their rights and their obligations. Characteristics of the implementation by associated partners, well, they participate, as I mentioned, at their own cost. They do not receive EU funding. They perform action tasks directly because they do not sign the grant agreement. And the consortium remains responsible towards the granting authority for the action tasks performed by the associated partner.
In the same line as this, I saw that the question is it possible for a freelancer to participate in a European project, and what are the related constraints? Do you have an answer to that? I think it's the normal rules that govern anybody who participates in the framework program, or? Nicole, you have any extension on what I said? Because it depends on what you call a freelancer.
Yes, a freelance. Well, there are specific rules that cover the freelancers, and there are opportunities, particularly under the Marie Skłodowska-Curie actions, which will allow freelancers, well, individual researchers, as we call them, to participate.
Ulrich, you have an addition?
Just to add, generally speaking, natural persons can also participate. You know, you can participate normally. The most standard way would, of course, be to participate as an organization with employees, but a natural person can also participate, to the very best of my knowledge. And indeed, the rules would be the same. It's just basically a different legal form, whether you're a natural person or an established organization. But the details, I think, you would have to go into the guidance that is available on the portal.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, then a small clarification for international collaboration flagging. If a topic is flagged, is international mandatory? Is it mandatory to engage in international collaboration, or is a different focus possible?
Thank you for this clarification. No, international cooperation, even in a topic that is flagged, is not mandatory. It is merely a suggestion to be followed.
Yes, indeed, like in all proposals, you have to argue your case, even if it's mentioned in the topic. So we go back to lump sum funding. How does lump sum work in very large calls with a budget of, say, for instance, 20 million? Are there possible pitfalls when estimating such large costs? Ulrich?
Yeah, generally speaking, we avoid very, very large calls, very large grants, or calls that lead to very large grants. I'm not sure if such thing happens now in cluster 2. I think the maximum, the biggest lump sum grants that we've had so far were basically testing more or less this mark that is given in the question, roughly 20 million. And indeed, the bigger the grant, the more work package and the more beneficiaries you have, the more complex will this lump sum budget table be. But again, I would say the necessity to estimate the budget is also, you also have that, of course, in a standard grant. You also need to come up with budget figures and details and build a 20 million euro budget. And you also have to have the underpinning information to do that. So again, I'd say it's not impossible. For us, it's more a technical constraint that this lump sum budget table becomes then quite big. And that is also a reason why we then so far have been cautious in going for the very biggest calls in Horizon and avoid lump sum funding for those.
Perhaps I can just add to this that one of the reasons we're using it in cluster 2 for the largest topic that we have available under the cultural cloud is simply because you are making a large infrastructure preparation, and therefore lump sum is appropriate for these actions. So just a clarification. And about the budget Excel table, I can see that there is a question on that, which is mentioned in the lump sum contract. Where do you find that?
So there is for information a table published on the Funding and Tenders portal in the section under reference documents, and you find it there under templates, along with all other templates. There is a template for the lump sum Horizon Europe. If you, of course, select the program in the Funding Tenders portal, Horizon Europe, reference documents, then you will find it there. But I can only emphasize again, when actually making your application, do use the version that is published in your submission tool. Don't use any other version. Use the version that is provided in the submission system for that particular topic.
Okay, it seems we are continuing with lump sum. It says or the next question says, must actual staff cost be used for budgeting lump sum grants, or is there a daily rate reference for each staff category to be used?
You should use the staff costs, the estimated staff costs in your organization using the best available knowledge at the time of grant writing. And the way that you enter these staff costs in the lump sum budget table is in the form of personnel costs per month. So it's not a daily rate there. We use there a monthly rate so that you can also then see, as in the standard grant application, an overview of person months per work package and per participant. You enter this resolved by staff categories. So we want there to see senior scientists or equivalent senior staff, experienced scientists or experienced staff, like postdocs, for example, and then you have PhD students or the lower grade scientists or equivalent. And these, I think there's 4 staff categories with short definitions, or their equivalent, let's say in the private sector. You enter the amount of months that you need each of these, and then of course you enter the amount of euro per month, and that gives the cost for that staff, or for that staff category, I should say. Of course, there can be, behind the number of months that you enter, you can of course have several different people. That's not resolved per individual staff, but just per staff category. And in this way, our evaluators can also assess whether this is indeed appropriate for the activity that you propose. In other words, do you need this amount of senior staff? Do you need this amount of experienced staff, and so on? This needs to be resolved by that. And as I said, there's no daily rate. You have, which is the way of claiming personnel cost and actual cost grants in the lump sum. In the lump sum budget table, you enter personnel cost per month.
Okay, thank you very much, Ulrich. I think this means that we are more or less at the end of the questions and answers session. I don't know if we still have time to answer one question. There is a question about the Horizon 2020 definition, third-party in-kind contribution against payment. Is that still available, or do we have anything like that? Is any of you aware of this? I'm not, to be perfectly honest with. So perhaps this is one of the questions that we have to push to the frequently asked questions. And I think with that, we would like to conclude this questions and answer sessions. And I would like to thank you very much for your attention. And to my fellow panel members, I would like to say thank you to you for your participation and your answers given. We will now have a short break, after which we will continue with a session which is called Innovative Research on Democracy and Governance, which is moderated by our colleague Katja Reppel. Thank you very much.